November 6, 1895. Fifth Avenue, New York City. 300 policemen can't hold the crowd back. They've been gathering since before dawn, thousands of them, pressed against the barricades, standing on each other's shoulders, craning their necks for a single glimpse of the bride. The newspapers have been building to this moment for months. The city is electric. Inside St. Thomas Church, 400 of the wealthiest people in America sit waiting in the pews. The flowers alone cost a small fortune. The organ has been playing for 20 minutes. The groom is late. He's been in a back room, finishing negotiations over his settlement. Last-minute adjustments, a few more guarantees. The lawyers needed more time. The Duke of Marlborough, Charles Spencer Churchill, one of the grandest titles in England, could not walk to that altar until every dollar was accounted for. The bride is also late, but for different reasons. When her carriage finally arrives, the crowd surges, those close enough to see her face go quiet for just a moment. Something is wrong. Behind the veil, 18-year-old Consuelo Vanderbilt has clearly been crying. Her face is swollen. Her eyes are raw. She steps out anyway, takes her father's arm, and walks toward the doors. She walks down the aisle anyway. Consuelo Vanderbilt, granddaughter of the richest man in America, the most photographed debutante of her generation, is about to become the Duchess of Marlborough. Her dowry, $2.5 million in railroad stock, will rescue a crumbling English palace she has never loved and a man she does not want. Her happiness is not part of the contract. It never was. This was not a love story. It was a transaction, one of hundreds. Between 1870 and 1914, more than 450 American heiresses crossed the Atlantic to marry into European aristocracy. They traded fortunes for titles, dollars for dukes. Their collective dowries amounted to what today would be billions. Entire American industrial empires quietly drained into the walls of decaying English estates. The British press called it an American invasion. The American press, on its more honest days, called it what it was, selling daughters to the highest bidder. History would give them a prettier name: the dollar princesses. But behind that glittering phrase was something darker. A system built by desperate men who needed money and ambitious mothers who needed status, and sustained entirely by the silence of the young women caught between them. Girls who were groomed, pressured, coerced, and delivered to strangers on both sides of an ocean, while crowds gathered outside and newspapers printed the dress measurements, and nobody thought to ask if she was all right. Consuelo Vanderbilt was crying on her wedding day. This is the story of why, and of all the others who never got to say so. To understand why British aristocrats suddenly found themselves willing, eager even, to marry American girls they had spent generations looking down on, you have to understand one thing first. They were broke. Not quietly uncomfortable, not modestly inconvenienced. Broke in the way that old, proud, land-heavy families go broke, slowly, then all at once, with everything still looking magnificent from the outside while the rot spreads through the walls. For centuries, English nobility had built their world on land. They owned vast estates, collected rent from tenant farmers, and lived off agricultural income that felt as permanent and God-given as the English countryside itself. Parliament had even codified this arrangement in 1815 with the Corn Laws, protective tariffs that kept cheap foreign grain out of British markets and kept domestic prices and aristocratic profits comfortably high. Then, in 1846, Parliament repealed them. The immediate effects were modest enough that no one panicked. British agriculture kept humming through the 1850s and 60s, and the lords of their great estates had little reason to worry. But something had been set in motion, quiet, patient, and ultimately devastating. By the 1870s, American farmers were tearing open the prairies of the Midwest. Steam-powered ships were crossing the Atlantic faster and cheaper than anyone had thought possible a decade before. And suddenly, Wheat grown in Kansas cost less on the docks of London than wheat grown 50 miles away in Kent. What followed was swift and merciless. Wheat prices collapsed, falling by half between 1870 and 1894. Land values plummeted with them. Tenant farmers went bankrupt and stopped paying rent. By 1885, Britain had lost over 1 million acres of productive wheat land, and the great aristocratic families, those ancient titled portrait-line dynasties, watched their income evaporate, while the cost of maintaining their enormous estates stayed brutally, immovably fixed. Oscar Wilde caught the absurdity perfectly. In The Importance of Being Earnest, written in 1895, the very year Consuelo Vanderbilt walked weeping down the aisle, Lady Bracknell interrogates a potential suitor about his income. Does it come from land or investments? Investments, he says. That is satisfactory, she declares. Land has ceased to be either a profit or a pleasure. It gives one position and prevents one from keeping it up. Audiences laughed. They laughed because it was true. In 1809, 88% of British millionaires had been landowners. By 1914, that figure had collapsed to 33%. Old money was dying, and the great houses, those staggering monuments to centuries of inherited privilege, were dying with them. But selling was unthinkable. These weren't simply homes. They were the physical embodiment of bloodline, of legacy, of everything a family had been for 300 years. A duke who sold his ancestral seat wasn't just making a financial decision. He was confessing failure to every ancestor whose portrait hung in the gallery. And working, actually earning a living, was equally impossible. Victorian social codes were rigid on this point. A gentleman might invest, but he could not be seen to earn. Trade was vulgar. Commerce was beneath him. The very activities that might have saved these families were, by the rules of their own class, forbidden. Which left precisely one option: marriage. A bride with a substantial dowry could inject capital without the stain of commerce. She could restore the roof, rehire the servants, replant the gardens, and keep the whole magnificent illusion intact for one more generation. Clean money, quiet money, money that arrived wrapped in orange blossoms and a wedding veil, and therefore didn't count as trade. All that was needed was finding a woman rich enough to afford the price of admission. Here was the problem. Wealthy English families were suffering the same agricultural crisis. Their daughters came with diminished settlements, or none at all. The traditional marriage market had dried up from the inside. But across the Atlantic, something extraordinary was happening. American industrialists, men who had built railroads, refined oil, mined coal, and manufactured steel with a ruthlessness that the old world found both appalling and magnetic, had accumulated fortunes that dwarfed anything the English aristocracy had ever possessed. The Vanderbilts alone controlled more capital than the combined treasuries of several European nations. These men had means on a scale that made the average English duke look like a tenant farmer himself. What they didn't have was standing. In New York, the old Knickerbocker families, the ones who traced their lineage back to the original Dutch settlers, looked at the newly rich industrialists and saw exactly what they wanted to see: vulgar upstarts with too much money and no breeding. Mrs. Astor's famous ballroom held 400 guests, precisely calibrated to represent the outer limit of respectable society, and many of the wealthiest families in America couldn't get through the door. Daughters of railroad barons and mining magnates found themselves shut out of the social recognition their fathers' fortunes should have guaranteed. A British title, however, was something even Mrs. Astor couldn't dismiss. No amount of New York snobbery could diminish a duchess. A woman who married into the British peerage would be received at the court of St. James, presented to royalty, addressed by a title that predated the American Republic by centuries. She would be, by any measure that mattered in that world, untouchable. The transaction practically arranged itself. British nobles had titles and no capital. American industrialists had capital and no titles. their children could solve both problems at once. By the 1880s, this exchange had become so routine that an entire industry emerged to facilitate it. A publication called Titled Americans listed not only which American women had already married into European aristocracy, but helpfully catalogued the eligible British peers still available, along with frank assessments of their debts and the condition of their estates. It was, in effect, a shopping catalogue for daughters. Matchmaking mothers on both sides of the Atlantic studied these listings with the intensity of generals planning campaigns. Professional intermediaries appeared, society women who, for a fee, would arrange introductions between cash-rich American families and title-rich British ones. London debutante seasons became hunting grounds, where American girls, chaperoned by mothers with spreadsheet minds and steel ambitions, were paraded before earls and viscounts who appraised them with the same cool detachment they applied to horseflesh. The numbers tell the story plainly. According to the 1915 edition of Titled Americans, 454 American heiresses had married into European nobility since 1870. 102 of those marriages were to British aristocrats. 6 were to dukes, the highest rank below royalty. The Library of Congress calculated that American brides had married into more than a third of the House of Lords. At least $50 million, several billion in today's money, flowed from American bank accounts into British estates during this period. Some historians place the true figure considerably higher. British aristocracy was being rescued, one American heiress at a time. But here is what the society pages never mentioned, what the breathless headlines about gowns and titles and transatlantic romance were careful to obscure. These were not equal partnerships. Under British law, a husband assumed complete control of his wife's property the moment she married him. Legal protections that existed for women in America simply didn't follow them across the ocean. An American heiress who married a British peer surrendered her dowry entirely, along with her home, her country, her family, and very often her future. The great houses she was bought to save were frequently cold, dark, and primitive by American standards. Central heating was rare, indoor plumbing was rarer. One duchess reportedly discovered that drawing a bath required a housemaid to make 5 separate trips from the basement kitchen, hauling jugs of hot water up multiple flights of stairs. Many of these brides were teenagers, married before they understood what they were agreeing to. Their opinions were rarely solicited. Their consent was routinely coerced. The mothers who arranged these matches told themselves they were securing their daughters' futures. The fathers who signed the checks told themselves they were purchasing elevation. The grooms who accepted the settlements told themselves they were preserving their heritage. Nobody asked the brides what they told themselves. In 1874, the first of these defining marriages took place. A dark-eyed young woman from Brooklyn, daughter of a Wall Street speculator, married the son of a duke after knowing him for exactly 3 days. Her name was Jenny Jerome. Her son would one day save Britain from Nazi Germany, and she would teach every ambitious American mother precisely how the game was played. Leonard Jerome made and lost fortunes the way other men changed their minds, casually, repeatedly, and with a kind of reckless pleasure that suggested the money was never really the point. On Wall Street, where he earned the nickname King, he ran hard and won big. Then he lost big, rebuilt, and lost again. He owned racehorses and founded racetracks. He kept a mansion on Madison Square with a private theater that seated 600 guests, something no other private home in New York could claim. He threw parties that became legend. He also kept mistresses, several of them, openly, unapologetically. This was the fact that would, in a roundabout way, change the course of the 20th century. In 1867, his wife Clara had finally endured enough. She packed up their 3 daughters, Clara, Jenny, and Leonie, and sailed for Paris. An ocean, she had decided, was the minimum acceptable distance between herself and her husband's infidelities. The girls would be raised as European ladies, educated in French language and culture, insulated from the gossip that trailed their father's name through every drawing room in New York. Jenny was 13 years old. Paris did not merely polish her, it remade her entirely. She studied piano under Stephen Heller, a close friend of Chopin, who believed she had genuine concert-level talent if she was willing to work for it. She absorbed French literature, French art, the particular kind of intellectual seriousness that Paris in the 1860s wore like a second skin. By the time she reached her late teens, Jenny Jerome had become something that American finishing schools almost never produced. A young woman who was not merely accomplished but genuinely interesting. She was also striking in a way that stopped rooms. One admirer, Lord Davenant, would later write that there was more of the panther than of the woman in her look. Dark-haired, dark-eyed, with an intensity that unsettled as much as it charmed. She reportedly had a small snake tattooed on her wrist, scandalous for a woman of her class, electrifying to the men who caught a glimpse of it. In the world of English drawing rooms, where well-bred women were expected to be decorative and carefully muted, Jenny Jerome arrived like a weather system. In August of 1873, the Jerome family traveled to the Isle of Wight for a sailing regatta. A ball followed. There, at 19, Jenny was introduced to Lord Randolph Churchill, 24 years old, third son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, possessed of a family name that stretched back to Blenheim Palace in the early 18th century. Within 3 days, they were engaged. Lord Randolph wrote to his father immediately, announcing his intention to marry the American girl. The Duke and Duchess of Marlborough were not pleased. They were appalled. That their son would bind himself to anyone after a 3-day acquaintance was alarming enough. That the anyone in question was an American, daughter of a Wall Street speculator with a taste for scandal, was simply unacceptable. They demanded the engagement be called off. Lord Randolph refused. Jenny refused. And Leonard Jerome, a man who had built his career on the art of the deal, sat down and began discussing terms. What followed was 8 months of transatlantic correspondence. Lawyers in New York, Paris, and London circling each other like prize fighters. Each letter probing for weakness, each counteroffer testing resolve. The Churchills found Leonard's initial proposal insulting. Leonard found their expectations extortionate. The Duke made clear that his son carried significant debts. Leonard made clear that his daughter was not a rescue fund with a heartbeat. Round after round, offer and counter, the slow, grinding negotiation of two proud men who both understood that the marriage was going to happen regardless and were simply determining at what price. By spring of 1874, they had their agreement. Leonard would provide £50,000 as a marriage settlement, a substantial sum. But he insisted on one unusual provision. £1,000 per year would be paid directly to Jenny herself, not to her husband. It was a small act of paternal foresight, and a rare one. In a legal landscape where British marriage law handed a husband complete control over his wife's assets, the moment she said her vows, Leonard had carved out a sliver of independence for his daughter. It wasn't much, but it was something. On April 15, 1874, Jenny Jerome married Lord Randolph Churchill at the British Embassy in Paris. She was 20 years old. She had known her husband for less than a year and spent most of that time separated from him by an ocean. 7 months later, on November 30th, she gave birth to a son at Blenheim Palace. The family reported the baby had arrived 2 months premature, the result of a fall Jenny had taken while out with a shooting party. Those close enough to observe noted that the infant seemed remarkably robust for a child born so early. They named him Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. Whatever the precise circumstances of his arrival, Winston Churchill would grow up to reshape the 20th century. And much of what made him capable of doing so, the restlessness, the audacity, the refusal to accept defeat as a final condition, came directly from his mother. Jenny was a revelation in English society. British women of her class were expected to be ornamental, silent, gracefully peripheral to their husbands' ambitions. Jenny was none of these things. She was opinionated, politically engaged, and ferociously intelligent. As Lord Randolph rose through conservative politics in the 1880s, she wrote speeches, cultivated allies, and worked rooms with a skill that career politicians openly envied. Some historians credit her as the de facto architect behind his ascent to Chancellor of the Exchequer, a claim that would have scandalized Victorian England and would not have surprised anyone who actually knew her. Her social ascent was equally formidable. Despite the initial suspicion that followed any American newcomer into British aristocratic circles, Jenny charmed her way to the very top. She became a close friend of the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, and was rumoured, credibly, to have been considerably more than a friend for a time. When he was crowned in 1902, Jenny was among the 3 former mistresses invited to attend the ceremony at Westminster Abbey. That detail alone tells you everything about the kind of woman she had become and the kind of world she had conquered. But marriages, even useful ones, have their seasons. By the late 1880s, Lord Randolph was deteriorating. Whatever was destroying him, possibly syphilis, possibly a brain tumor, the diagnosis remains disputed a century later. It was taking him apart from the inside. His behavior grew erratic. His moods turned violent. His political judgment, once sharp enough to make enemies nervous, became reckless and unreliable. In 1886, he resigned from the cabinet in a fit of wounded pride, fully expecting to be begged to return. No one begged. His career was over. He died on January 24, 1895, at 45. Jenny was a widow at 41. She did not remain one for long. In 1900, she married George Cornwallis West, an officer in the Scots Guards who was 26 years old, the same age as her son Winston. Society was scandalized. Jenny was, by all available evidence, entirely indifferent to this. The marriage lasted until 1914, when George left her for the actress Mrs. Patrick Campbell. 4 years later, at 64, Jenny married again. Her third husband, Montague Porch, was a civil servant who was 3 years younger than Winston. When asked about the age difference, Porch reportedly replied that he had a great fondness for older women. They remained married until her death. Between husbands, Jenny kept herself occupied in the way that only a certain kind of woman can, not with idleness, but with purpose. She founded and edited a literary quarterly, the Anglo-Saxon Review. She wrote plays. During the Boer War, she raised funds to equip an entire hospital ship, the Maine, and personally oversaw its operations in South Africa. She championed her son Winston's career with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. Writing letters, pulling strings, leveraging every connection she had accumulated across 30 years at the center of English public life. Their correspondence is remarkable reading. She pushing him forward. He seeking her approval. Both of them playing, with great seriousness, a game neither had fully chosen, but both had decided to win. In May of 1921, Jenny fell down a staircase and broke her ankle. Gangrene set in. Doctors amputated her left leg below the knee. 2 weeks later, on June 29th, she hemorrhaged and died. Winston, by then a rising figure, whose best years still lay ahead of him, was devastated, but characteristically measured in how he expressed it. "I do not feel a sense of tragedy," he wrote, "but only loss. Her life was a full one. The wind was in her veins." Jenny Jerome had crossed the Atlantic as an outsider, an American interloper whose family had traded dollars for a foothold in a world that considered itself too refined to need her. She left it as the mother of the man who would save that world from itself. She had not bent to aristocratic society. She had bent it toward her and made it grateful for the accommodation. she had shown what was possible. Other American mothers were watching, taking notes, sharpening their plans, none more carefully and none more dangerously than Alva Vanderbilt. Alva Erskine Smith was born with ambitions she had absolutely no money to support. Her family in Mobile, Alabama, had what the antebellum South had always prized most: respectable lineage, refined manners, the correct last name. What they lacked, with increasing desperation in the years after the Civil War, was the one thing that actually kept the lights on: hard currency. The Smiths had pretensions. They did not have means. And Alva grew up understanding, with the cold clarity of a child who pays close attention, that the distance between those two conditions could only be closed one way. She made her marriage in 1875. William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the legendary Commodore, heir to a share of the largest private fortune in America. William was handsome, agreeable, and essentially a very expensive set of keys. Alva was 22, ferociously intelligent, and already burning with plans that required a great deal of financing. Within a decade, she had completed her first transformation. The penniless girl from Mobile had become the most powerful hostess in New York. Her weapon, characteristically, was not charm, it was architecture. In 1882, Alva unveiled a limestone palace at 665th Avenue, a full French Renaissance chateau dropped onto Manhattan's most prestigious street like a declaration of war. Nothing like it existed in private hands in America. 3 stories of carved stone, soaring turrets, interiors sourced from the great houses of Europe. The building didn't whisper that the Vanderbilts had arrived. It announced it at full volume. And New York society, guarded by the formidable Caroline Astor, refused to hear it. The old Knickerbocker families had their own calculus of respectability, and railroad money, no matter how much of it there was, registered as vulgar. The Vanderbilts could build all the chateau they liked. Mrs. Astor's ballroom held 400 guests, and the Vanderbilts were not among them. Alva's response was elegant and merciless. In March of 1883, she announced a costume ball to celebrate her new mansion, the most lavish private party New York had ever seen. Invitations went to everyone who mattered. Everyone, conspicuously, except Mrs. Astor. The city went into a frenzy. Costumes were commissioned from Paris. Newspapers devoted entire pages to speculation about who would wear what. Mrs. Astor's daughter Carrie had been rehearsing a special quadrille with her friends for weeks, fully expecting to perform it at the ball. No invitation came. Carrie was devastated. Her mother was cornered. And Caroline Astor, the woman who had spent years drawing the line that kept the Vanderbilts out, did the one thing she had sworn she would never do. She sent her calling card to Alva Vanderbilt. In the rigid etiquette of Gilded Age New York, this gesture carried the weight of a formal treaty. The Vanderbilts were now, officially, acceptable. Alva had won. But winning Mrs. Astor was never the real objective. It was a warm-up, a proof of concept. Alva had always been playing a longer game, and at the center of that game was her only daughter, born in 1877 and named Consuelo, after Alva's closest friend. From the moment Consuelo could walk, Alva began building her. Not raising her, building her. The distinction matters. Consuelo was educated entirely at home, surrounded by governesses and tutors who answered solely to Alva. By 8 years old, she could read and write in English, French, and German. Every Saturday, without exception, she was required to stand before her mother and recite poetry in all 3 languages, while Alva listened, assessed, and found fault. There was no swimming, no tennis, no golf. The only pleasure Consuelo would later recall from her entire childhood was a weekly dancing class taught by an elderly instructor named Mr. Dodsworth. Even this, of course, served a purpose. A future duchess needed to know how to waltz. Physical perfection mattered as much as intellectual performance. Alva was consumed by the question of posture. A duchess, she believed, did not merely stand straight. She held herself like a queen. And so Alva commissioned a device to ensure her daughter met this standard. It was a steel rod, fitted to run the full length of Consuelo's spine. Leather straps secured it at the waist and over the shoulders, locking her back into rigid alignment. She wore this during her lessons. Hour after hour, the metal pressing into her vertebrae while she tried to write, to read, to concentrate on conjugating French verbs, to simply exist without pain. Holding a book meant raising it to eye level. Writing was nearly impossible. Sitting was an exercise in sustained endurance. Consuelo wore this device throughout her adolescence. When she fell short of her mother's expectations, when her posture slipped, when a recitation faltered, when she made the catastrophic error of expressing an opinion of her own, Alva reached for the riding crop. The punishments were not occasional, they were routine, a feature of the household, not an aberration. Years later, Consuelo would recall the precise moment she understood her position in Alva's architecture. As a teenager, she had objected to a dress her mother had selected, a small thing. The instinct of a young woman wanting the most ordinary kind of agency. Some say, in how she appeared to the world. Alva's response was immediate and absolute. I do the thinking. You do as you are told. 7 words. They defined a childhood. They would echo, years later, through the wreckage of a marriage. By her late teens, Consuelo had become exactly what Alva had designed. Tall, slender, elegant, fluent in 3 languages, graceful under scrutiny, composed under pressure, and, beneath all of it, completely subjugated. She was also, by every account, genuinely beautiful. Dark eyes, a long, graceful neck, a presence that commanded attention in any room she entered. Proposals arrived. Alva received at least 5 on her daughter's behalf, including one from a Battenberg prince. She rejected them all. None were grand enough. And then Consuelo did something her mother had never anticipated, had never built a contingency for, had never once considered in all her years of meticulous planning. She fell in love. His name was Winthrop Rutherford. He came from impeccable old Knickerbocker stock, descended from exactly the families that had once looked down on the Vanderbilts. He was tall, athletic, and widely regarded as the most handsome bachelor in New York society. He was also 33, 15 years older than Consuelo, and he had no title whatsoever. He was merely rich, merely American, merely the man Consuelo had chosen entirely for herself. To Alva, he was unacceptable. They became secretly engaged anyway. When Alva discovered the relationship, and Alva always discovered everything, she responded with the full force of a woman who had never once lost a battle she cared about winning. She banned Consuelo from seeing Rutherford. She intercepted the girl's mail. She stationed servants to monitor her daughter's movements around the clock. When Rutherford came to the door, he was turned away. Consuelo was, in every meaningful sense, a prisoner in her own home. Desperate, she began planning to elope. Rutherford would meet her. They would leave before Alva could stop them. It was the only act of genuine rebellion Consuelo had ever attempted in her life. Alva found out. She locked her daughter in her bedroom. Through the closed door, she delivered her ultimatum. If Consuelo attempted to see Rutherford again, Alva would have him killed. Whether she meant it literally is something history cannot settle. Consuelo believed her completely. But physical threats were never Alva's most powerful instrument. She knew her daughter too well for that. She understood the years of conditioning, the guilt, the hunger for approval, the deeply trained instinct to yield, and so she deployed the weapon she had always kept in reserve. She collapsed, took to her bed, stopped eating, wept with the commitment of a woman who had decided the performance of her life depended on this particular scene. She told Consuelo that the disobedience was destroying her health, that continuing this romance would kill her. Day after day, Consuelo sat with the sight of her mother wasting, or appearing to waste, and was told, quietly and consistently, that only her surrender could stop it. Finally, she broke. She gave up Winthrop Rutherford. Alva made a full and rapid recovery. Now the campaign could enter its final phase. Alva had already selected the groom. Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, was 24 years old, physically unremarkable, and almost universally disliked by the people who knew him. Contemporaries described him as surly, suspicious, critical, and intellectually hollow. His nickname was Sonny, an irony so complete it bordered on cruelty. What he had was Blenheim Palace, one of the grandest houses in England, and a title that would make whoever married him a duchess. What he didn't have was the money to sustain either. Alva arranged the introduction, maneuvered her daughter into his presence at every opportunity, first in England, then back in America at Marble House, the Vanderbilt summer residence in Newport. In the Gothic room of that palazzo, surrounded by medieval stonework and pointed arches, the Duke of Marlborough proposed to Consuelo Vanderbilt. She accepted, because she had no choice. The engagement was announced. The wedding was scheduled. The contracts were drawn. Alva had achieved exactly what she had set out to achieve from the moment her daughter first learned to walk. Consuelo would become a duchess. What she would become, beyond that, was a grief that Alva had not bothered to calculate, because Alva had never once included her daughter's interior life in any of her equations. On the morning of November 6, 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt woke to her wedding day and spent it crying alone in her room. No one came to her, not her governess, not her maids, not a single friend or relative who might have sat beside her and said something true and kind. Alva had posted a footman outside her bedroom door with explicit instructions: admit no one. Whatever was happening on the other side of that door, and everyone in that household knew exactly what was happening, it would happen in private, and it would happen without interference. So Consuelo dressed alone. She put on the elaborate lingerie with its real lace trim, the white silk stockings, the satin shoes, moving through each step with the mechanical precision of someone performing a task they have rehearsed beyond the point of feeling. She would describe it years later with a precision that is more devastating than any outrage could be. She dressed, she wrote, like an automaton, a machine executing its programming, a body going through the motions while the person inside it had gone somewhere else entirely. The gown waited. Cream satin, a 5-foot train trimmed in heirloom lace, the sleeves fashioned in the leg of mutton style that was the height of 1895 elegance. On her head, a wreath of orange blossoms, the symbol of bridal purity that Queen Victoria had made fashionable when she married Prince Albert half a century earlier. Her bouquet was an enormous arrangement of orchids that had been shipped across the Atlantic from the greenhouses of Blenheim Palace itself. Even the flowers came from the groom's estate. A small detail, and not an accidental one. She was not choosing a destination. She was being delivered to one. She felt cold. She felt numb. And she could not stop crying. Meanwhile, at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, the spectacle was already in full operation. Thousands had been gathering since before dawn, pressing against the police barricades, climbing whatever they could find for a better vantage point. Inside, the pews held 400 guests. The wealthiest, the most titled, the most socially indispensable people in New York. The organist had been playing for some time. The flowers were extraordinary. The occasion was, by every external measure, glorious. But look more carefully and the cracks were visible. Most of the extended Vanderbilt family had declined to attend. The bride's side of the church was complicated by the fact of her parents' recent and acrimonious divorce. The groom's side was thin. The whole assembled pageant had the atmosphere, if you were paying close attention, not of a celebration but of a closing. The formal conclusion of a business arrangement that had been negotiated for months by men in rooms Consuelo had never been invited to enter. The Duke of Marlborough was late. He had spent his wedding morning in meetings with lawyers, working through last-minute negotiations over the settlement. Even now, with 400 guests seated, and the organist cycling through his repertoire for the third time, Charles Spencer Churchill was in a back room, haggling over the precise terms of his compensation. The final figures had been agreed upon months ago. But the Duke wanted assurances. He wanted guarantees in writing. He wanted every penny he had been promised documented and legally secured before he walked to that altar and said the words that would make it official. The groom would not proceed without his money confirmed. The bride could not proceed because she could not stop weeping. When Consuelo finally emerged from the house to take her place in the carriage beside her father, it was visible to everyone present that she had been crying for hours. Her face was blotched and raw beneath the veil. Her eyes were swollen. William Kissam Vanderbilt, a man who had spent years losing battles to the woman he had divorced, climbed in beside his daughter and said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was about to give his child away to a man she did not love, in a ceremony designed and stage-managed by a woman he could no longer stand, and the irreversibility of what was about to happen sat between them in that carriage like a third passenger. The ride to the church must have felt endless. At St. Thomas, the guests waited. 20 minutes passed. Murmurs moved through the pews. Had something gone wrong? Had the bride reconsidered? The answer to the second question was almost certainly yes. The answer to the first depended on how you defined wrong. She had not changed her mind. She had simply been unable to stop crying long enough to leave on schedule. When Consuelo finally appeared at the church entrance, the congregation rose. 8 bridesmaids in matching gowns went ahead of her. Her father took her arm. The organ swelled into something triumphant. And Consuelo Vanderbilt, 18 years old, dark-eyed, genuinely beautiful and completely destroyed, began the longest walk of her life. She moved toward the altar where the Duke stood waiting. His expression, those close enough to observe reported, was unreadable. Whatever a young woman might reasonably feel on her wedding day, the particular mixture of joy and nerves and the specific excitement of beginning something she has chosen, Consuelo felt none of it. She felt the weight of the gown. She felt her father's arm under her hand. She felt the hot tears continuing to slide down her face behind the veil that was, in the end, not quite sufficient to hide them from the people watching closely enough to look. The ceremony proceeded. The vows were exchanged. The words of the episcopal ritual were spoken over 2 people who had been brought to this moment by entirely different forces. His by bankruptcy and ancestral obligation. Hers by a mother who had never once asked what she wanted. When it was over, Consuelo Vanderbilt was Her Grace, the Duchess of Marlborough. Then came the part the congregation didn't see. Before the bride and groom could emerge to face the public, the wedding party retired to the vestry, that small, practical room behind the altar where the business of religion is administered. There, surrounded by vestments and prayer books and the residue of the sacred, the marriage contract was produced. Signatures were required. This was not a formality. The Duke had insisted on it. The financial settlement, the transfer of railroad stock, the guaranteed annual income, the provisions and covenants that would permanently bind Vanderbilt capital to the Spencer Churchill estate, needed to be legally executed at the earliest possible moment, which meant now. Minutes after the vows, before the newlyweds had even turned to face their guests. Consuelo signed. The Duke signed. The lawyers witnessed. Now they could go meet their public. The reception filled Alva's townhouse on 72nd Street with champagne and toasts, and the particular gaiety of people who have attended a transaction they have agreed to call a wedding. The newspapers, which Alva had been feeding curated details for months, reported with breathless enthusiasm the gown, the flowers, the guest list, and in a detail Alva had personally leaked to generate maximum excitement, the gold fastenings on the bride's undergarments. The headlines the next morning were rapturous. She is now a duchess. Thousands of women had besieged the church. The whole city had turned out to watch. One satirical cartoon cut through all of it. It showed Consuelo kneeling at the altar in her wedding gown, her hands shackled behind her back, a chain running directly to her mother. The cartoonist had understood, in a single image, what the society pages had spent months carefully obscuring. This had been a sale. The ceremony was the paperwork, and the cruelest part had not yet happened. After the reception, after the farewells, after the crowds went home and the newspapers went to press, the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough sailed for Europe. Paris first, then England, then Blenheim. In those early weeks, the Duke applied himself to educating his new wife, drilling her on the Spencer-Churchill family tree, the precise hierarchies of British aristocracy, the protocols she would need to master. He took her to the House of Worth in Paris and selected gowns appropriate to her new rank. He spent Vanderbilt money replenishing the family jewels, acquiring pearls that had once belonged to Catherine the Great and the Empress Eugenie. And then, somewhere in those honeymoon weeks, in a moment Consuelo would carry for the rest of her life, the Duke told her the truth. He had, he explained, been in love with someone else. He had given up the woman he actually wanted in order to marry her. He felt no romantic attachment to his new wife and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He had married Consuelo because it was the only available mechanism for saving Blenheim. The palace was his entire purpose. She was the means of preserving it. He said this without cruelty, without anger. He said it the way a man states the terms of an arrangement to someone who has just signed the contract, plainly, cleanly, as a matter of established fact. The transaction was complete. There was no longer any reason for pretense. He had purchased what he needed with his title. She had paid for it with everything else. Consuelo was 19 years old. She was a duchess. She had surrendered the man she loved, survived years of her mother's systematic demolition of her will, walked down an aisle in tears in front of 400 people, and signed her inheritance over to a stranger in a vestry, all to arrive here, in a palace she hadn't chosen, beside a man who had just told her, with perfect composure, that she was essentially furniture. She would later call her memoir The Glitter and the Gold. She had discovered on her honeymoon what the glitter was worth. Beneath it lay only cold stone. The palace that awaited Consuelo Vanderbilt was not what anyone had described to her. Blenheim had been built between 1705 and 1722 as a gift from a grateful nation. Queen Anne's reward to the first Duke of Marlborough for his military victories over the French. The architect John Vanbrugh had designed it to rival Versailles itself. Not merely a home, but a statement in stone that Britain's greatest general deserved a monument to match any king's. For nearly 2 centuries, the Spencer-Churchills had occupied this testament to national glory, generation after generation, moving through its 300 rooms like custodians of something too large and too ancient to fully comprehend. But monuments require money, and the Marlboroughs had long since run out of it. By the time Consuelo arrived in the winter of 1895, Blenheim was a magnificent ruin in slow motion. The 5th Duke had spent with catastrophic enthusiasm. The 7th had been forced to sell paintings, furniture, and eventually the famous Sunderland Library, 18,000 rare volumes auctioned off one by one, to cover debts that kept accumulating faster than the sales could address them. The 8th Duke, the current Duke's own father, had died, leaving the estate virtually bankrupt. What remained by the time Consuelo crossed its threshold as its new duchess was essentially the architecture itself: 300 rooms, acres of deteriorating lead roofing, miles of corridors that leaked cold air in winter and smelled of damp stone in every season, and an appetite for repairs that had no bottom. The grandeur was still visible, but it was the grandeur of something that had stopped being maintained and hadn't yet finished falling. This was what Consuelo's dowry had been purchased to rescue. Restoration began almost immediately. Before the honeymoon was even over, the Duke had started replenishing what his ancestors had sold. The jewels acquired in Paris were only the opening move. Tapestries, paintings, and furniture were sourced across Europe and shipped to Oxfordshire. The household staff expanded dramatically: 40 servants for the interior alone, another 50 for the grounds. Blenheim would operate again as a great estate, fully staffed, fully furnished, restored to something approaching its former scale. The Duke threw himself into this project with a focus that surprised people who had found him sullen and disengaged in other contexts. He commissioned the French landscape architect Achille Duchesne to design elaborate formal water gardens on the palace terraces. He redecorated the staterooms on the western side with gilded paneling in conscious imitation of Versailles, an irony that apparently escaped him, given that Vanbrugh had designed Blenheim specifically to outshine Louis XIV's creation. The interiors became pastiches of French royal taste, beautiful in their way, derivative in a way the Duke would later come to regret. But the building was saved. Whatever else could be said about Charles Spencer Churchill, and a great deal could, he had stopped the decay. The human cost of that salvation fell almost entirely on Consuelo. Shortly after her arrival in England, she was summoned to meet the Dowager Duchess, her husband's grandmother, a woman of advanced age and absolutely undiminished directness. The old woman had no interest in pleasantries. She had a message to deliver, and she delivered it without preface. "Your first duty," she informed Consuelo, "is to have a child. And it must be a son. It would be intolerable to have that little upstart Winston become Duke." The little upstart in question was Winston Churchill, son of Lord Randolph and Jenny Jerome, born in this very palace 21 years earlier. As the Duke's closest male relative, Winston stood next in the line of inheritance should Consuelo fail to produce a male heir. The Dowager Duchess found this prospect not merely undesirable, but personally offensive. Consuelo understood the assignment. In September of 1897, she gave birth to a son, John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, who would carry the courtesy title Marquis of Blandford. The following year, she delivered a second boy, Ivor Charles. She had provided, as she would later phrase it, with the bitter precision of someone who has earned the right to dark humour, the heir and the spare. The succession was secured. Winston Churchill would have to find his own path to history. With her dynastic obligations discharged, Consuelo might reasonably have retreated into the decorative role her position prescribed. The endless cycle of house parties and country visits, the correct gowns for the correct occasions, the performance of aristocratic contentment. It was what was expected. It was what most women in her position chose, or accepted, or resigned themselves to calling choice. Consuelo went in an entirely different direction. She discovered the tenants. Blenheim's estate encompassed thousands of acres and hundreds of families who worked the land or served the household, people whose lives had been organized around the palace's needs for generations, and whom generations of Marlboroughs had regarded as part of the landscape rather than as human beings with particular addressable suffering. Consuelo walked out to meet them. She went down the muddy lanes between the tenant cottages, knocked on doors, sat in cramped kitchens, and looked at the actual conditions of the people whose labour sustained the world she had been purchased to ornament. What she found shocked her. Cottages were dark and poorly ventilated. Sanitation was primitive. Children worked instead of attending school. Medical care was essentially non-existent. The families who had spent generations supporting one of England's greatest houses had never been visited by anyone from inside it who came to ask how they were. She brought food. She brought medicine. She brought attention to problems that had been invisible to every Marlborough before her, and she kept coming back. The tenants, who had expected nothing from another foreign duchess imported to refinance the estate, found themselves with something they hadn't known to hope for: an advocate. They adored her for it, with a loyalty that outlasted her marriage, outlasted her title, and outlasted the Duke himself. Her work expanded outward from the estate. Consuelo became involved in causes affecting women and children across Britain: sanitation reform, education access, workers' rights. By the standards of Edwardian aristocracy, her politics were dangerously progressive. She supported free school meals, healthcare for children, and old age pensions, positions that made her peers uncomfortable and that she held without apparent concern for their discomfort. She would later become an active supporter of women's suffrage, following, in this as in so much else, a path her mother had taken, though for reasons Alva would not have recognized in herself. In society, Consuelo exceeded every expectation that had been set against her. The English had braced for another gauche American, all money and no manners, loud and unformed, tolerable only for what she brought to the estate's bank account. What they encountered instead was a woman of extraordinary beauty, genuine intelligence, and a social grace that required no instruction. She charmed the Prince of Wales. She became a fixture in the Marlborough House set. She attended Queen Victoria's funeral and served as canopy bearer to Queen Alexandra at Edward VII's coronation. She travelled to the court of Tsar Nicholas II. The playwright J.M. Barrie, who had just given the world Peter Pan, spoke for a generation of admirers when he said he would stand in the street all day simply to watch her get into her carriage. None of it brought her 1 inch closer to her husband. The Duke had his clubs, his sports, his consuming preoccupation with the palace's restoration. They existed in the same vast house as strangers who had been assigned to share a name. Travel became Consuelo's primary escape. Paris, most of all, where she could sometimes breathe, sometimes laugh, sometimes spend time with her father in the uncomplicated warmth of his company. Back at Blenheim, she found unexpected solace in a friendship that the Duke had not calculated for. Winston Churchill, the young man whose inheritance Consuelo's sons had displaced, was a frequent presence at Blenheim during these years. She found him magnetic. He was, she later wrote, the life and soul of every brilliant circle that gathered around him, his conversation invariably stimulating, his mind restless and generous, in ways her husband's never was. She noted, with a precision that left nothing unclear, that Winston's opinions were not, as Marlborough's were, drawn and quartered by self-importance. Their friendship endured for decades, long past the end of the marriage that had brought them into the same orbit. In 1905, the family sat for John Singer's Sargent. The resulting portrait still hangs in Blenheim's red drawing room. The Duke in his robes, Consuelo resplendent in white satin, their 2 young sons arranged between them. It is a magnificent image. It is also, if you know what you're looking at, a picture of a marriage that was already over. By the time Sargent finished his work, the Duke and Duchess had ceased to function as a couple in any meaningful sense. They maintained separate lives within the palace's vast indifference, their encounters governed by protocol and social obligation rather than anything resembling feeling. In 1906, after 11 years, they formally separated. Consuelo left Blenheim and moved into Sunderland House, the London mansion her father had built for her on Curzon Street. She did not return as a resident. At 29, she was a duchess without a duke, a mother whose sons would be raised primarily by their father, a woman who had surrendered her youth to a house that had accepted the sacrifice without ever making room for her inside it. The palace had been saved. Vanderbilt money continued to flow as the settlement required, and Blenheim continued to thrive on American dollars. The water gardens blooming, the staterooms gleaming, visitors arriving to marvel at the restoration as though it had occurred by some natural process. as though beauty simply renewed itself, as though no one had paid. Consuelo would write years later that through all her time at Blenheim, she had felt like nothing more than a beautiful figurehead, ornamental, expensive, utterly without agency. The cage had been gilded with her own inheritance. Now, finally, the door stood open. 15 years passed between the separation and the divorce. 15 years during which Consuelo remained the Duchess of Marlborough in name, maintained her London residence while the Duke occupied Blenheim, attended the same social functions, moved through the same circles, and shared, in the most technical sense imaginable, a marriage. Their sons travelled between both households. The adults lived as strangers who happened to share a surname and a legal document, which in Edwardian England was considered a perfectly functional arrangement. The Duke, meanwhile, had found someone else. Gladys Deakin was another American, born in Paris to expatriate parents, striking in her beauty, formidable in her intelligence, and fixated on Charles Spencer Churchill since the age of 14. When she first heard of his engagement to Consuelo Vanderbilt in 1895, the teenage Gladys had written to her mother with undisguised dismay that she was simply too young to catch him yet. She was not speaking loosely. She meant it as a project, and she pursued it with the patience of someone who understood that the right opportunity, held in mind long enough, eventually arrives. By the late 1890s, Gladys had positioned herself with considerable skill inside the Marlborough social orbit. She visited Blenheim as a guest. She befriended Consuelo, genuinely, by most accounts, which makes the whole architecture of it more unsettling rather than less. She dazzled London society with a combination of beauty and wit that made her genuinely dangerous company. And when the Marlboroughs formally separated in 1906, the affair between Gladys and the Duke began in earnest. For the next 15 years, she was his mistress, while Consuelo remained his wife. The situation was, by the standards of their world, not particularly scandalous. It was simply how things were. When the divorce was finally granted in 1921, both parties moved to remarry with minimal delay. The Duke married Gladys Deakin in Paris that same year. She was 40 years old. She had devoted more than half her life to this singular ambition. She had won. The victory proved catastrophic. Their marriage deteriorated into open hostility with a speed that surprised even people who had found the Duke difficult in his better moods. By 1933, he had evicted Gladys from the palace entirely. He died the following year. The woman who had spent 26 years maneuvering to become Duchess of Marlborough spent her final decades living in increasing isolation, eventually found by authorities in the mid-1970s in a state of profound neglect, surrounded by goats she had let loose inside Blenheim's dower house. She died in 1977 in a psychiatric facility. History has a particular cruelty reserved for women who want things too openly. Consuelo's second marriage followed an entirely different arc, which is to say, it was a love story. On the 4th of July, 1921, just weeks after her divorce was finalized, she married Jacques Balsan, French aviator, pioneer of balloon and aircraft flight, a man who had once collaborated with the Wright brothers and who was, additionally, heir to a substantial textile manufacturing fortune. But none of that was why she married him. She married him because she had chosen him, entirely, freely, without a mother's hand at her back or a lawyer's contract being signed in a vestry. They had known each other for nearly 30 years. Balsan had first encountered Consuelo when she was 17, still living under Alva's absolute governance, still being shaped into the instrument her mother intended her to become. He had, by his own account, fallen in love with her immediately. He had waited, not passively, but with the quiet conviction of someone who believed, against considerable evidence, that the situation would eventually resolve itself in the direction of sense. It had taken 26 years. But here they were. They settled in France, dividing their time between Paris and a chateau near Dreux. Later, they built a home in Florida, near Palm Beach. Consuelo named it Casa Alva. That name requires a moment. After everything, the steel rod against her spine, the riding crop, the intercepted letters, the locked bedroom door, the threat against Rutherford, the theatrical collapse, the wedding day spent weeping alone while a footman stood guard outside, Consuelo named her home after her mother. Not in bitterness, in something that had, somehow, across the intervening years, become recognizable as love. What happened between these two women in the second half of their lives is not a simple story of forgiveness, because forgiveness implies a clean ledger, and this was nothing so tidy. It was something stranger and more honest, a slow, difficult renegotiation of a relationship that had been built entirely on power, conducted between two women who were both, in their different ways, genuinely extraordinary. After her second husband, Oliver Belmont, died in 1908, Alva had found a new cause, and she had pursued it with the same ferocious, all-consuming energy she had once directed at New York society and her daughter's marriage prospects. The cause was women's suffrage. She joined the National American Woman Suffrage Association. She founded her own Political Equality Association. She opened Marble House, the Newport Palace where the Duke of Marlborough had once proposed to Consuelo in the Gothic Room for suffrage conventions and fundraising events. By 1916, she had helped found the National Woman's Party alongside Alice Paul. She organized the first ever picketing at the White House. She brought British suffragettes to America for speaking tours and bankrolled campaigns that more cautious donors wouldn't touch. The woman who had spent decades denying her own daughter any say in the most fundamental decision of her life was now fighting, with genuine ferocity, for the right of all women to govern themselves. History is rarely this pointed in its ironies. Usually it leaves you room to look away. Alva's story does not. And yet, somewhere in these years, the reconciliation happened, gradually, then more completely. The relationship that had been built entirely on dominion, Alva directing, Consuelo obeying, no other dynamic ever permitted, slowly became something that both women seemed to find worth preserving. By the early 1920s, they were close again. Not in the way of people who have forgotten what happened, in the way of people who have decided, with full knowledge of what happened, to choose each other anyway. Then came the annulment, and Alva was asked to account for herself. The Duke of Marlborough had converted to Roman Catholicism following his second marriage. Under canon law, this created a problem. The Catholic Church did not recognize civil divorce. In the eyes of Rome, he remained married to his first wife, which meant his second marriage existed in a state of theological illegitimacy. There was precisely one remedy. The first marriage would need to be declared null and void from its inception. Under Catholic canon law, coercion was sufficient grounds. A marriage entered under duress was no marriage at all, and could be annulled as if it had never existed. The Duke approached Consuelo with the request. She agreed to cooperate with a directness that suggests she found a certain satisfaction in making the whole arrangement official. The marriage had been a transaction from the beginning. The Church would now simply confirm what everyone involved had always known. But an annulment required testimony. It required someone to state, on the record, before a Vatican tribunal, that Consuelo Vanderbilt had been forced into this marriage against her will. In 1926, Alva Belmont appeared before an investigator working on behalf of Rome. She was 73 years old. She had spent the previous 2 decades as one of the most prominent advocates for women's autonomy in the United States, and she was now being asked to testify about the specific instance in which she had destroyed her own daughters. She did not hesitate. She did not qualify. She did not reach for the vocabulary of maternal good intentions or the language of a different era's customs. "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke," she stated. "I have always had absolute power over my daughter." On August 19, 1926, the Vatican declared the marriage null and void. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, it had never been valid. 31 years after that weeping bride walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Church with red eyes and a fixed direction, the institution whose blessing had made the whole transaction sacred had formally agreed that it shouldn't have happened at all. The newspapers seized on Alva's confession with the delight of people who have been waiting a long time for a particular story to complete itself. Here was the champion of women's rights admitting, under oath, that she had denied her own daughter the most fundamental right imaginable, the right to choose. The hypocrisy was real, and the press was not wrong to name it. But Consuelo did not condemn her mother publicly. Not then, not ever. The confession had been necessary. It had freed them both from the last legal vestige of something that should never have existed. That was enough. Alva died in Paris in 1933, at 80. She left $100,000 to the National Woman's Party. The building she had purchased as their headquarters still stands on Capitol Hill, now designated the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, her name on a building devoted to the cause she'd spent her final years advancing, the cause she had spent the first half of her life actively undermining. Consuelo and Jacques remained married and, by every available account, genuinely happy, until his death in 1956. In 1953, she published her memoir. She called it The Glitter and the Gold, the title she had earned on her honeymoon, in the moment the Duke explained the terms of what she had purchased with her freedom. She died in 1964 at 87. Her burial instructions were precise. She wished to be interred at St. Martin's Church in Blaydon, the parish church that sits within sight of Blenheim Palace, beside the grave of her younger son, Lord Iver, whom she had outlived. After everything that had been done to her in that palace's name, after the steel rod and the riding crop, the locked door and the forced signature, the honeymoon confession and the 11 years of a marriage that was never anything but a contract, Consuelo Vanderbilt chose to spend eternity within sight of the walls she had been sold to save. Make of that what you will. She had made her peace with it, on her own terms, in her own time. That, in the end, was the only thing that had ever truly been hers. Consuelo Vanderbilt was not an exception. She was the most visible example of a system that processed hundreds of women across 4 decades and called the results society news. Between 1870 and 1914, more than 100 British aristocrats married American women. 6 of those men were dukes. American money flowed into 1/3 of the House of Lords. The exchange was so routine, so thoroughly institutionalized, that publications existed solely to catalogue the available inventory on both sides: the eligible peers, their debts, the condition of their estates, the American heiresses still unclaimed. A market operating in plain sight, with daughters as the commodity, and everyone carefully agreeing not to use that word. Some of those marriages ended in the predictable wreckage. Others produced something no one had planned for. Mary Leiter was born in Chicago in 1870, daughter of Levi Leiter, co-founder of what would become Marshall Field and Company. Like Consuelo, she had been groomed for a grand match. Unlike Consuelo, she chose her own. When Mary met George Curzon at a London ball in 1890, a conservative MP with a brilliant future and a crumbling estate, she fell in love on the spot and wrote to a friend that same evening that she intended to have him, because she believed he needed her, and she had no shame about her determination. They married in 1895, the same year Consuelo walked weeping toward a man she hadn't chosen. In 1898, George Curzon was appointed Viceroy of India. Mary became Vicereine, second only to the Queen in the hierarchy of the British Empire. At the Delhi Durbar of 1902, she wore a gown embroidered with gold thread and peacock feathers, each eye set with a beetle wing that spectators mistook for emeralds. The crowd was reportedly breathless as she passed. She championed medical care for Indian women, established scholarships for female doctors, and threw herself into the demands of the position with an energy that the climate and the scale of it slowly, irreversibly consumed. Mary Curzon died in 1906. She was 36 years old. The girl from Chicago had risen higher than any American woman before her. It had cost her everything she had. Nancy Langhorne arrived at a different kind of power by a different route entirely. Born in Danville, Virginia in 1879, she made a disastrous first marriage at 18, divorced in 1903, and sailed for England 2 years later, with the particular freedom of a woman who has already survived one catastrophe and has decided to be deliberate about what comes next. She met Waldorf Astor at a house party. They married. His father gave them Cliveden, one of the grandest estates in England, as a wedding gift. When Waldorf inherited his father's viscountcy in 1919, British law required him to leave the House of Commons for the Lords. His constituency needed a new representative. Nancy decided to run. On December 1st, 1919, she became the first woman ever to take her seat in the British House of Commons. She held it for 26 years. When Winston Churchill told her that having a woman in Parliament felt like being intruded upon in his bathroom, she informed him that he wasn't handsome enough to warrant such concerns. 2 American women. One became the most powerful woman in the British Empire. The other dismantled one of its oldest barriers. Neither had arrived as a purchased bride, but both had crossed the same ocean on the same basic current. American money meeting British prestige, daughters moving between worlds that needed something from each other. The current ran further than anyone imagined. In 1880, a New York heiress named Frances Ellen Work married an Irishman named James Boothby Burke Roche, against her father's explicit wishes and over his threat to disinherit her. The marriage was unhappy. It ended. Frances came home. But James eventually inherited a title, the 3rd Baron Fermoy. His son became the 4th. The 4th Baron's daughter, Frances Ruth, married John Spencer, the 8th Earl Spencer. And in 1961, Frances Ruth gave birth to a daughter named Diana. Princess Diana, the most photographed, most mourned, most mythologized woman of the late 20th century, carried American blood. Her sons carry it still. The future King of England traces part of his lineage to a Manhattan stockbroker's rebellious daughter who married against her father's wishes and came to regret it. The dollar princesses saved the great estates. Tourists walk through Blenheim today and stop in front of the sergeant portrait, the Duke in his robes, Consuelo resplendent in white satin, their sons between them, and see a magnificent image of aristocratic permanence. They don't see the weeping bride behind the veil. They don't see the footman posted outside the locked bedroom door. They don't see the contract signed in the vestry while the congregation waited. But the women knew. They always knew. Some of them found misery. Some found purpose. A rare few found love. All of them discovered that a title is not a life. It is a requirement and someone has to pay for it. Consuelo Vanderbilt paid in full. She paid with her youth, her freedom, her first love, and 11 years inside a palace that accepted her money and never quite accepted her. And then, when it was finally over, she built something that was entirely her own. She was a Vanderbilt. She was a duchess. She was, at the end, Madame Balsan, a woman who had chosen her own name, her own home, her own life, on her own terms. She died in 1964 at 87 and was buried in England, within sight of the palace walls, not because the palace had owned her, because she had decided, in the end, that she was done being owned by anything, including her own bitterness. She was free.